My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. I've known Michael Chu, founder of Treehouse Games, for quite a while. We met at Riot Games, where he spent much of his early career. As you'll hear, he joined Riot directly after graduating from USC, but stayed connected to the folks that he worked on game projects with during the programs at USC, as well as partner schools that he had connected with during his time there. So when he decided it was time to start a new studio, he was tapped into those long-standing relationships to find the right co-founder from amongst those that he had worked with, including folks who had spent a lot of time at startups. As Treehouse gets closer and closer to releasing their first game, Michael shared more of the details of his journey with me and the lessons he's learned along the way. Let's jump in. The question that I really love to start with, that I think tells me so much about people, how people come to this founding journey and what was really the trigger for it, is there was a moment where you went from, maybe I should make this game company thing, maybe I should go on a founding journey, to no, I'm emotionally committed to it. I'm going to do it. Now I just have to figure out what the right steps are. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what led up to that moment and what pushed you over the edge.
Yeah. So I was worn down over time. So I actually first thought about doing a startup out of college. I went to USC, which has like a air quotes older games program. Mm-hmm. And, we were working on this student project. And the whole purpose of it was to break into the games industry. So we were going to spend 12 months, 30 some odd students making 5 minutes of gameplay at AAA quality. And then show the industry, hey, everybody, we can do this. Now teach us to do it better and faster. And it ended up working out really well, right? My co-founder is someone that I worked with back from that project. The creative director at Treehouse is someone that we worked with on that project. Mm-hmm. And, we were getting so much positive press about the game. It was this third-person action stealth game about teleportation called Blink. And we were getting so much positive press about it that we had that moment of considering, hey, should we actually start a studio and finish this as a game? But, we were disciplined, appropriately afraid of all the things we didn't know, mm-hmm. and ultimately decided, no, our original intent was to get jobs in the industry because there's so much we don't know. Best case scenario, this is the worst game we ever make. And so stuck with our original intent in that big team. I'm still really proud that a huge portion of that team ended up working in the industry. And my now co-founder, he has been a serial entrepreneur since then. He's worked at 4 back-to-back gaming startups. This one with Treehouse is the second one he's been a co-founder for. And, we would stay in touch, play games together. And every 6 months or so, he'd start to say, hey, when are we going to do that startup that we always thought we were going to do? And pretty much for years, I would say, hey, I'm at Riot. I'm having a great time. I'm learning so much. All these people are really amazing. And they keep giving me new opportunities and responsibility. And I want to keep learning. And I hit this tipping point coming up on 7 years in, where I started to really feel like I was kind of capping out where I was at Riot. I felt like my rate of learning had slowed. I had done some of the hardest things that I could really conceive of doing while working on League of Legends, and felt like I wanted to do something very different. And again, I think was kind of maybe appropriately afraid of, man, my almost all my experience in game dev has been through this one company, right? What kind of blinders do I have? And wanting to find an experience that was really different. I think a startup was very different in comparison.
Mm-hmm. So, you've had been able to sort of live vicariously through your friend who became your co-founder and his startup journeys. Did him sharing his previous experiences help inform you on that choice, like
Definitely.
as you were thinking about that, right? Because, like, to your point, like, I think there is a level of, like, perhaps appropriate trepidation on going on a startup journey. Like, was any of that demystified from having been on the sidelines watching your friend do it?
100%. So I grew up in the Silicon Valley, and I think a lot of startup culture was kind of maybe a little gross and cringe for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
And watching Silicon Valley, the TV show, like one episode in, I was like, I have to turn this off. This is just too real. Like I know too many people like this. And hearing from my co-founder really demystified a lot of things. It also just made it feel very real. Hearing about the real trials, how many problems are ultimately just human problems, but also it his lived experience doing it still felt very close to a lot of what we had started doing in school. And that's still proven to be true, where a lot of our experience as just students with nothing to lose, trying every freaking thing that you can think of, is still very relevant to now being a startup founder years in. And I think the combination of being able to talk with my co-founder about that in a lower pressure environment, like hear his musings about it, hear about when things went really right and when they went really wrong, combined with coming from Riot, there were just so many of our colleagues that have gone off and done startups. Getting to talk with you, getting to talk with other people who had started that journey before me, also made it go from this big foggy unknown to no, no, no. There is a way to structure your thinking about what kind of risks are involved. There are ways to think about how you build your team, how you get funding, how you mitigate some of the risk, and a clear set of skills, at least for some of it, that you can start to build and actually wrap your head around instead of
Yeah.
just I guess it's a startup now. Like, I registered a C Corp or whatever, and now I'm a CEO. And there is more of a explicit path to follow, even though it doesn't look like that from the outside.
So you made the decision to, like, okay, I think I'm at this point. I've seen a lot of people go before me. I have this friend who we have a long history of trust, and he's been through it. Let's do it. You've emotionally committed to this path. What became that big learning journey for you? What was the thing that you were like, okay, well, now I gotta learn how to do all of this now that I've committed to that path?
God, I feel like that answer could be different for every 3 month chunk after leaving Riot.
Yeah.
Because it really felt like some new thing was the new super focus and the new existential need. And I think the first and foremost one was how different it was working in a big established studio where everyone sort of has a well defined responsibility and a discipline lane that they're supposed to stay in and things that you owe to each other or your stakeholders or whoever. I think I left Riot working on like a 73-person team, 72-person team. And then the next day was my co founder and myself, period. And that was a real wake up call for if you don't think about it, if you don't plan for it, if you don't do it, it just simply doesn't happen. On the flip side, if you do think of it and you do actually act on it, that's something that was a huge add to what you're trying to do that you may never have otherwise done, and that's really gratifying. It's really exciting, and it's also kind of dangerous and addictive because you could just you know run that hamster wheel forever, telling yourself that you can lift any mountain, but you kind of have to believe that, especially at the start of the journey, to just throw yourself against these various problems of how do we get funding, how do we hire our first couple people that fill in the skill sets that we do not have, how do we go from a couple people who get to come into this with so much existing alignment and translate that to no, here is the way to think about this that is going to lead to a good result and is going to last beyond hiring person number 3 and 4, and then hopefully many more people beyond that. So all of that was so manual, and it was just purely down to you as an individual sitting down, trying to sort through 100 things you could be doing, picking out the top couple that actually mattered, and then running that thing viciously into the ground until it was good enough for you to move on. And that's just all on you. It's just entirely on you to define and pick, which was cool and scary.
And scary. Yes.
And scary.
One of the things that I'm always conscious of is the people who listen to this podcast, at least some portion, are before that decision point, right? Like they're like, maybe I should start something. And they're trying to work themselves to that emotional point, or they're sort of living life and seeing where and when they get that conviction. From your sort of journey, making that decision, coming to that conclusion, and then the immediate aftermath of like, okay, now I got to go and learn all this stuff. What is sort of the biggest learning from that start of the journey that you would teach someone who's like, maybe I want to start something?
Oh, the start of the journey to decide?
Yeah.
Ooh, I think for me, it had to be a plan that made sense. And before that, it's an exciting idea that I think pretty much everyone has had at some point. And especially if there are a lot of people who are like, so many people who work in games, I think, start with the romantic notion of being like, oh my God, I grew up on this amazing experience. What if I could make that? What if I could build something like from scratch that is that thing that creates such a strong emotional reaction in other people? But that's pretty different from a plan. And so the thing that started to make it feel real for me was not just, oh, hey, here's a cool game idea, right? In fact, I saw that almost as a trap because of a lot of the advice that my co-founder had for me, which was, hey, he had seen so many startups that were really an excuse to ship a specific game idea and then were completely lacking in so many other things that are pretty necessary to have a effective, happy, capable, team develop out of it. And, even in the best case scenario where the game is awesome, doesn't immediately dissolve afterward because there was nothing else keeping that group together. And so for me, a lot of it was figuring out how to build a plan that made it go from fun, fancy to here's a thing that I could actually go and do and actually holds water and doesn't sound like crazy BS, but could actually lead to being able to, afford my mortgage, one, still pay rent, still pay for groceries, but also could be a real path toward, hey, we want to build games like this. We want to build experiences like this. We can't do that as a team of 2. Okay, so if we actually need a bigger team, how do we do that? How do we actually go from this being a cool idea to something that is actually battle hardened and gets feedback way before launch? Like, what would actually make that happen? And once we had more and more plans for that, it started to feel like, okay, we actually have this endless list of things we could do. Which ones are most important? And at that point, you're almost already mentally into it. You're already mentally doing that instead of thinking what if. You're already ready to execute.
You've spoken a lot, I think, at this point about you and your co-founder, how you guys originally met and how you've stayed in touch and sort of his background, at least from the sort of entrepreneurial side. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, we often talk about like co-founder makeup and like who's the tech co-founder versus the design whatever, right? Like when you were thinking about setting out on this journey and you knew you were going to do it with your longtime friend, how did you guys discuss or think about who you were as co-founders and what you each brought to the business, and how and why you thought that would be complementary, and perhaps even like what his perspective was on like why did he want to found with you specifically? Presumably because you guys have a long history of trust, but what else besides that when this is like such a foundational piece of the business?
Yeah. So no, that's a great question. Honestly, I feel like the co-founder setup is the single most important thing for, God, I was going to say forever, and maybe that is true actually. But it's incredibly important, and it makes me scared for other people when I hear about, hey, I met my co-founder from this forum or something like that, and that's such a different experience than really getting to know that person and really having the trust to be able to talk with them about anything that's hard. So, you know, the way we met actually is that we were both students at the time. I was going to USC. I was in the games program. I was working on a capstone project, which is effectively like, hey, your project is accepted to be like a formal um, uh, class project for the program. And I was the only producer because I guess a lot of people who want to work in games don't think about being the people organizer person.
Turns out.
Uh, and we had come up with this idea, which was like, hey, USC had a relationship with like one specific art school, and I thought that was kind of weird because I was like, LA has so many amazing art schools. Why is that a one-off relationship? And so a big thing that I did was I would sneak out of my internship at lunch and I would drive to these art schools and I would stalk every art professor until I found one that used to work in games. And I would cold reach out to them until they were willing to have a meeting. And I would go meet with them over lunch and I'd say, hey, we're building the student game project. We really want it to be like a portfolio piece that really like proves we should be in the industry. Do you think your students would be interested in that? And it's not about us taking credit as like the design school or whatever the hell. We're all just students trying to make it, and nothing will be better than a killer portfolio piece. And that's where I met my now co-founder Ryan. He was a student in one of those art schools, and he didn't tell me until years later, but a few months after we started working together, he dropped out of art school because he was like, this is so much more the real development experience. And I would have been terrified of that. Like, oh my God, you're like dropping your degree because you're working on this project. That's insane.
Yeah.
But we had worked together really well then. He was an environment artist when I met him, extremely organized. Uh, Very quickly, it became, hey, you're so on top of your stuff and you're so thoughtful of how it fits into the rest of the game. Can you actually help me organize all of the other 3D artists on the team? And in the years since, he's self-trained as a tech artist. And now, many years after that, he has shipped games as a designer, as an engineer. And he, in his last startup, even took over as the CEO for a couple of years when, shit really hit the fan unexpectedly. And so he is the most jack of all trades, like developer that I know, still the fastest prototyper I know after my years in the industry. And for us, we were looking at sort of our experiences, and we saw that we were kind of coming at it from pretty different uh, reference pools at this point. Where for him, he had been addicted to the fast moving, super agile. You could wear any hat, you can help out in a ton of different ways. You can do any job that needs to get done to make the game good. And for me, it was a lot of product management training and working with big, like complex teams on huge live services. And we would make a change on League. Like I would ship a skin, I would work on a character, I'd work on some systems change. And then within a week, you'd hear what 100 million people had to say about it. And pretty critical for me was 2016, 2017, when League was getting destroyed by mobile competitors. That led to a big wake up call for the whole company. But a lot of the way that we thought about it was really like, what needs are changing for players around the world? And I think that was a very uh, thoughtful way to understand on a human level, like, what do people want out of games? Like, what are we losing for chasing this competitive pinnacle to the end? And for Ryan and myself, when we looked at each other, we saw in each other a lot of strengths that we really cared about. For me, it was kind of obvious. Like I respected him tremendously as a developer, but also as like a leader that he had grown into. He already had, frankly, back in college days, but like now he'd really been through the fire in terms of some of the worst scenarios that I'd heard of like publisher that they signed with going under, being part of the launch slate for Apple Arcade, like real proof of fire. And then for his side, from seeing so many indie studios, he had felt like, oh man, I have so many cases where their strategic approach and their organization toward those goals is really lacking. And because of that, they just implode. Like the team falls apart. They don't have a clear mission. They don't have a way of organizing their work in a way that works beyond like three people who are kind of best buds living in one living room. And he had remembered my time working in school, where even though I had like virtually no training, there was a lot of my philosophy and my desire to make every voice matter and to rope that into one clear plan that really resonated with him, and he still felt was quite rare after his time working in the industry. And our talks back and forth, I think I started to add some other value, to be like, hey, there actually is this approach to thinking about our players that I've gotten to practice a lot, and I think is deeply right, that is about their needs and like what they look to games for in their lives, and a thought process that we should be really harsh on in terms of going from that need to how our game is answering that. And if we can't predict that delight now, then the odds of us lucking into that are like virtually nothing. And so we felt like we were really bringing in this sort of, global AAA production trained mindset mixed with this like super scrappy indie. We should be fearless and scrappy and appropriately like willing to try anything to get this done. And that was sort of the start of the studio, and why we sort of gravitated to each other. On top of just also knowing we trusted each other, we were both super pragmatic, super able to just be like, hey, like doing this felt really bad. Like it felt like we were just gonna fuck that up no matter what happened. Like that was just how I felt about that scenario. I don't know how true that is, but like we should talk about it. Being able to talk about that for virtually anything has been something we've relied on a lot.
Once it sort of, went from here's the theory to okay, now it's real. We are now the two co-founders of this business, and the whole business rests on our shoulders. What were the sort of big conversations and big steps from translating that here's what we value in each other to okay, here's how we actually work together effectively to carry this business?
Yeah. So we went, how would I describe it? Like top of the logic stack down to the bottom many times. So we talked about the type of studio we want to cultivate. We talk about playtesting philosophies and putting it in front of real players as soon as possible, and what part of the need space in the world we want to occupy, right? And a big part of it that was a really natural fit for us, because that's how we stayed in touch, was games as like the best way to create quality time with friends, right? And I had gotten a lot of insight into, because I'd watched how we were struggling to do that on League of Legends, and that's where like things like Teamfight Tactics and some of the other things that we shipped ultimately were angled toward. But the first 6-8 months were super fun, because a lot of it was going up and down this stack and being like, okay, we believe that these are the needs we should serve. This is how we want to develop. Okay, let's try that out. Let's actually bring a friend in that has experience in R&D, and we're just going to jam on game ideas. And then Ryan and I are going to back up and build this spiky prototype. And we're going to not spend too long on it. We're going to spend like a week on it, and then we're going to zoom out and really sketch out what the rest of the game would look like. We're going to iterate on it only once, and we're probably going to have a pretty decent idea of whether or not it actually hit our original intent, and if the idea was as juicy as we hoped it would be when we set out. And we just kept doing that process over and over again. And our executions of that only got better. And it kept helping us test all these really big, grand thinking things of, should we be working on one game for years? Or should we be trying to almost treat it like a shipyard, where it's like put together, strong thesis, put it out there, learn, work on the next ship. And we actually had something real to start considering that against. Hey, the third prototype we worked on, dude, I think that's just a way bigger game. Like that would not even be compatible with this model. If we're feeling like that's actually better, then that kind of means that model that we were thinking of just isn't going to work. And there were just so many, long work sessions where we're just jamming out docs or prototyping. And when I say prototyping, he was doing like 85%, 95% of the prototyping, because he was like, without exaggeration, like 100 times faster than me. but we traveled up and down that sort of stack and actually got to rough in a lot of the details and the approach we wanted to take over and over again. And that, I think, helped a lot to go from a lot of theory into closer to practice before there was more of a team, before there were a lot more people involved, before there was salaries to be paid.
And as that has sort of like evolved and you guys have scaled, you're now several years into this endeavor. You're closing in on shipping, what you guys ultimately sort of put a lot of time and effort against, and all of that. How has that division of the business, like, because it doesn't actually sound really like a division of the business, which is an interesting difference from a lot of folks that we've talked about, is like you both are playing roles but not dividing the business. You're not like, hey, you go look over here and I'm going to look over here, at least at the start. How has that evolved over time? Like how do you guys work as co-founders in not just with the two of you, but now with a larger team? Right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I did hit this break point, especially with fundraising, where I felt like I had to spend so much time thinking about a bunch of stuff that was not directly related to all the other things we were doing in development, that it did sort of fork my brain and then make me feel like I was not doing enough to like maintain that quality of collaboration that we had going before. And we did have to sort of divide out from there. Even now, I'm doing a lot more of the external facing, like marketing, playtesting. How do we translate, the things that we're hearing into development priorities, and then how do we tell them that how do we tell players, I mean, that these changes we're making are directly related to the things that you just shared. So I am more external facing now compared to when we were much smaller. And it's almost like as it grew more complex, like the Jenga-ing of who was holding up what had to get more complex. So Ryan is our game director, and I think something that has been consistent throughout is that we're both very product and player experience minded people, and I think we're both super, super practical and upfront about, hey, this other game is doing something kind of similar. We should seriously take a look at that. There isn't any preciousness for us about whether or not we're willing to look at that or be like salty that someone, air quotes, took our idea or whatever. Like, we just don't really have that. We're much more practical and see games as like always iterative and always like self-referential. And so, we will go through and talk through these things. And I can talk with him about this interesting marketing thing that I'm seeing this other game do. And he can tell me about, hey, this other game just did this. And I think, we're doing something way too complicated for hunger or whatever. And all the things in between, which we ultimately have to be really crisp on of, hey, we're saying this is like the coolest part of the game. What are we building that I could actually then show in gameplay footage and actually tell people this is a big part of the game?
Yeah.
And I think that through line has always been really valuable to rely on, and it's sort of the bridge where I think we both still feel like now for us, our current split of product and marketing are kind of just two sides of the same coin. And the biggest marketing choices you will make are your product decisions.
Turns
and
out.
feeling like those things are just shared, right? So why wouldn't we talk about them? And we've had fluctuations in and out where a lot of our early philosophies have been tested, and we've had to iterate and improve. And oftentimes we've also felt like when we've drifted from that has been our worst or most confusing parts of development, like in cases where we got skittish about playtesting, right? And I think those often felt like some of our most confused parts of development. And now, in the most recent arc for our current game that has been the most successful by far, really committing hard to that again because we had so much alignment on it. We cultivated a team that had so much alignment around it. But your original question was like, how did that relationship evolve? And it's like it evolved repeatedly But the part that I think probably helped it most was we were very conscious about talking about that and reflecting on that pretty consistently throughout. And even though we sometimes ran into ways of working together that were better or worse, like more effective or less effective, or made me feel like I was getting too far away from the game, like we could always just talk about that. And that led us to being able to adjust it over time, which I think is probably the most critical thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned fundraising, which I do want
Yes.
to talk about because it's always a fascinating part of the journey. And I think you are, so far in my guess, a little bit unique of the timing of your raises that I'd love to dig into. But to sort of lay the groundwork, um, could you tell us a little bit about how you're funded in whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah. So we've raised 2 rounds of VC venture capital funding. We raised a seed round in 2020, and we raised a Series A in 2021. So I think the distance between those two was a little more than a year and a half in terms of the distance between those rounds. We actually had a pretty long, like, strategic thought process and debate between Ryan and myself about how we were going to try and fund the company. Right, we were both in a spot where, thinking of the checklist of how this becomes real, we had both saved enough money to be able to do this startup and be like, hey, we can still pay our bills without needing to get paid next month, right? Like that's something that we had solved for ourselves, but nowhere near enough to actually pay a team of
Mm-hmm.
any real size. So we're like, okay, we're going to need external funding. We had a long debate of like, what are the incentives between a publisher and what are the incentives between like a venture capital firm, and what do we feel like better aligns with what we ultimately want to achieve, and also, like, frankly, what's happening in the world right now that would aid us or hurt us in that regard. And I think VC funding has become very common in the last 5-6 years in particular for games, because games has had a series of hype or hype adjacent moments that have either been very helpful or very painful to experience.
Mm-hmm.
You could find this easily online. All of our VC backers are all games specialized funds where they exclusively invest in games, and all of their leads in their firms are all former game developers themselves. And that's a relatively rare mix, but it's one that we tried to cultivate super hard.
I think you are the only guest I've had on so far who raised during 2020 and 2021. Most of the folks that I've been able to talk to so far and who have joined me on the podcast are folks who are sort of from my cohort of experience in the fundraising marketplace, which is basically 2023, late 2022, 2023 onwards, which has all been not fun in a variety of ways. But often, folks talk about 2020 and 2021 being sort of these moments, especially in the game space, where fundraising, like a lot of funds were coming in. There was a lot of fundraising. There was a lot of growth as far as valuations, as far as rounds happening, and all that kind of stuff. And so part of what I wanted to ask was just like, take me through your sort of experience in those two sort of moments of fundraising during these sort of hype cycles of games fundraising, and what was that like, and how do you reflect on that now in sort of the aftermath of that sort of crashing out?
Yeah. So overall, I feel very fortunate for having raised in that period, because uh, I think it is definitely more difficult to raise today than it was back then. Although I might caveat that a bit, because I think it may be similarly difficult to get a deal in 2020 versus now, but the terms were often better, or you could simply get more cash and better valuation for your stage of development. Um, so uh, it was an interesting period. So when we raised our seed round, we had this whole game plan of trying to raise in the weeks leading up to GDC. So we had scheduled out this whole plan and this whole Rolodex of people that we're going to reach out to and get contacts with, and warm intros from a lot of our old colleagues or other professional contacts. And we had scheduled out this, we're located in Los Angeles, both my co-founder and I, a week of pitching in LA, a week of pitching in SF, another week of pitching in LA, and then GDC to sort of wrap up a lot of conversations and meet, the other partners at these various firms. That was all completely dashed by COVID. That first week up in SF, 2 weeks before GDC, we had all these in-person meetings that were turning into calls. And we were like, what the hell is happening? Like, this is awful timing. We were pretty fortunate, though, in that, it felt very clear when we authentically and deeply clicked on the premise of our studio and why we were trying to raise and what we were trying to accomplish. And the difference between the people who felt like they got what we were doing and the people who did not was night and day. A lot of our intent was really to say, hey, games are becoming like a default way for people to spend time in the world together. And in many ways, North America is the furthest behind because we're still kind of held up by some of our stigma about playing games and dolls for girls and fire trucks for boys BS. And then here you have the rest of the world, particularly in like Latin America and Asia, where that stigma never existed. And you just have a huge proportion of the population of those countries who just play games because it's just a thing to do. It's just a way to hang out. It's an alternative to meeting up for dinner. And, we'd talk and talk about how we wanted to make games really tailored toward those needs. We'd have a couple people who were like, hey, we see that same trend. We have a lot of the same global understanding that you do. Here's a bunch of other studios that we've started to invest in that are thinking about similar hopes for where the world is headed. And then we'd have others who would go through this long thing and they'd be like, so is it kind of like FIFA? And we'd be like, no, I mean, that is also a video game, but that is kind of where the comparison ends. And my own experience on League tells me that a super competitive game like that is probably not the ripest ground for you and your best friend having an adventure together that you talk about years later. And so we're really fortunate in that we really clicked with one of those, and I think it's no coincidence that investor, London Venture Partners, is a games specialized investor. Mm-hmm. They had been investing in games years before a lot of the other waves that sort of brought a lot more investors to the scene. And I think that made for a much more authentic connection off the bat. And I think they would self-identify as very decisive. So when we actually hit that point where they were like, this is real, like we are seriously interested, we went from that first conversation to having a term sheet quite quickly. And fortunately, that interest was durable enough that when all hell broke loose with the pandemic, that they were still willing to honor that term sheet, even though it was really uncertain what that might mean financially for either of us. And the environment had changed tremendously by the time we hit 2021. There were so many more game investors approaching on the scene for two reasons. One, capital market wise, interest rate wise. Money was very cheap. A ton of parties were suddenly like, hey, what do we do with just crap loads of money? And then, there are, I think, a lot of swings in the narrative for games investing. A long time ago, it was like, oh, games, like, we don't know what is going to pop off, so we don't want to invest in that space. And I think right now, there was a lot of swing toward, whoa, some games can scale just like SaaS products. That's amazing. I love making buttloads of money. Don't you love making buttloads of money? We should make buttloads of money here, which is not entirely wrong, but I think that's probably a pretty thin look at the complexity of what's happening underneath, as I'm sure you've experienced. And then that was multiplied by multiple fold, I think, over the subsequent years by some very massive trends that landed in a very games adjacent space through crypto, through, I guess maybe Web3 is the more correct technical term, and through AI. Yeah. Because games are, I think, a pretty immediate way to conceptualize of a lot of those concepts. But again, I think the truth is for game development in general, the last 20% is so complicated that you can't treat it all with one brush.
Yep.
But the functional result is like, hey, this huge games fund in this space, like a big one, might have been like $40 million, $60 million, $80 million. And suddenly here comes this titan from the SaaS space where they're like, yeah, we're going to try it out, put out a probe. Like, well, let's put in $300 million and see what happens. And that was like their entry.
Yep.
And so suddenly you have people competing like crazy and valuations that rise a lot. And that is both good and bad, right? The good side is, the raw dollar count is what you need to pay people's salaries. But it also means your expectations go up. And so it is a double-edged sword both ways through. We had been working on a version of our game that we thought was really coming together and was really nailing a lot of that sort of premise. And that's why we raised our Series A. It's like, hey, the environment's really hot right now. We feel like we're really landing a lot of the value that we thought was going to be in this space. Like the game is fun in a bunch of ways that we hoped it would be fun. And now we got to build a lot more of it. So we probably need a bigger team. And so we went out and we raised a bigger round. The valuation went up pretty significantly, right? And we were able to look at that and be like, wow, like that's hard progress. And it hasn't really been a linear path since. That was 2021. Where we're recording this in 2025. We've definitely hit brick walls since then, where we had to like reset big chunks of the game, and we had to actually reduce the size of our team at the start of 2024, which really sucked. I think fortunately, like I've thought about this a lot, like, if we hadn't raised then, or if we had raised less money, would that have prevented me from making some of the mistakes that we made? And I think truthfully, the answer is no, because there's so many other factors for like the problems we were trying to solve that had nothing to do with like now having a lot more capital. And maybe in reverse, having that additional funding might have made some of those problems a lot more survivable. And now we're able to be like, damn, like we invested too much in this aspect of the game that ultimately proved to not be fun enough to justify it. And actually might even be confusing a lot of the core audience. Like crap, like that's a lot of wasted effort. Very expensive lesson to learn. Well, fortunately, we still have enough funds to actually ship the game under our own steam, which feels like a real luxury today. So I feel pretty fortunate to have raised in that period in those conditions, but it was also just the craziest like firestorm of excitement and an offshoot interest that was really difficult to predict, and a bunch of people saying, hey, where's the Web3 in your game? Or like, I hope you're not doing Web3 in your game. And it was just like this giant a maelstrom of different competing interests, where you're constantly trying to balance like your understanding or even desire to ride some of that momentum with it also having to make sense, and for you to again have a credible, believable story that you can tell yourself about how that makes sense in your game. And in some of those cases where those trends didn't fit, felt really rough because you just felt like you were the uncool kid, the uncool pitch that was ignoring the genius move in front of you, being on the outside circle because of it.
Yeah, I think that some of the hardest parts of fundraising is exactly that balance of you want the resources and not just like money, but like the people backing you and the support and the network to accomplish the big dream you have, but you're also having to guard against, am I signing up for someone else's big dream that they're going to try to turn my dream into? And like that tension is often, like, I think the Web3 case and the AI case today is a little bit more spoken than most, but oftentimes that tension is unspoken and you have to like feel it out, and it's quite hard.
Yeah, I think I got a lot of advice around that, right? And I think there is a kind of gross reality too, which is until you have your first term sheet, your willingness to flex in those ways is very high. And then as soon as that happens, you come back to this reality of like, whoa, we have to work with that person for like the next 5-10 years maybe. Like we want that relationship to be really good and based in like honesty about what we both want, like down to our bones. Like we should be trying to figure out our deepest understanding of each other in that regard, and expose that understanding to each other in a way that hopefully still adds to their excitement. And it feels like there's a really perverse incentive actually to wield the hype. use the sharpness of that, even though it does land you in these really awkward tensions sometimes.
As we sort of shift into more sections that are really like, all of this has been about your founding journey, but I really want to like put the microscope on you and your sort of emotional journey on this. But to close out the fundraising part, we've talked a lot about like the wildness of the market and sort of the ups and downs of the hype cycle and the choices you had to make for the business. But what was the hardest part of fundraising for you, Michael Chu, specifically?
Oh gosh. It feels like you're definitely not working on a game anymore. And it feels like the storytelling that is required to communicate what it is you're doing, why you think it's important, feels like it's on this razor's edge between like the most refined version of why you care to a grody sales pitch that you couldn't say in front of a mirror because that's so far out there that's crazy. And that tension I find very unenjoyable, because like so much of my approach with how we hire, with how we talk internally on the team, with how we talk with our board now, is just like, hey, here's what we're working on. Like, this is what we're worried about. This is what we want to do. Like, how do we shoot this full of holes? Because we really need to like refine this plan before we move on, right? And fundraising is not like that. It feels like really dressing up in a Hollywood way of like, here's my front veneer, and here's this like framing around it that stretches believability, and here's like me bragging about my credentials, like, oh God, the one example of this that made me so deeply uncomfortable is like for like 2.5 years I worked on the skins team at Riot. So working on League of Legends, it was the primary revenue team for all of for all of Riot at the time, right? This was like 2014 or so. And I was talking with some ex-Rioters that I used to work with. One of them used to actually be this e-commerce guy that I used to work with, right? A brilliant dude, right? And he had been part of a startup that was out there a couple of years ahead of me on the journey. And they were giving me feedback on the pitch, which was so helpful and super kind of them. And, I was talking about my own credentials, because in the seed round, that's a huge part of why any VC would invest in you. And, I was like, I worked on the revenue team. I helped launch these new products, right? And they were like, that is the least pizzazzy way you could possibly say this, right? And I was like, well, we work together. Like, well, what should I say? And he was like, what years did we work together again? And I was like, this year, and like a chunk of this year. And he was like, oh, cool. Okay, so you generated over $1 billion of revenue for Riot. And I was like, me?
Yes, you alone.
Exactly, right? Like that, but that's like the kind of language that flies back and forth in those conversations all the time. And you need to find the way to say that, knowing that they were also going to know that you're kind of fronting in a way. But on the inside, I'm like, dude, I was one of a team of like 32 at the time working on that. I also happened to be making monetized products for what was already becoming the biggest game in the world. I was not there early enough to like decide on the design fundamentals for League that made it so popular. I just make this skin that had so many players that it would make millions of dollars on the other side. But the reality of it is like, the VCs are very smart. They have like a series of criteria where it's like, dude, if they don't pass the smell test on all of these criteria, then my spidey sense rightfully tells me that this is going to be a bad idea. They are going to miss a skill set. They're going to miss a thought process, whatever. But, you drop a line like that of, hey, I've generated $1 billion for Riot. I've helped ship new product lines, blah, blah, blah. You move on. You say it subtly. the number of questions that I got in follow-up about our revenue strategy was a fraction of a lot of other founders I know. And that's just the reality of, I think, a lot of the startup world. And being a founder is just like, in many ways, I feel like all of the world is a persuasion check. And I'm very uncomfortable with that.
Yes.
I really want things to be based in a lot more truth and a lot more fact and a lot of like, this is a plan that makes logical sense because we've all grilled the crap out of it. And so being the person to sort of push that language is not my favorite place to be.
So shifting more broadly, and maybe the answer is the same for this question as well, but what do you think your biggest struggle is as a founder across the board, right? Like your journey as a founder so far, what has been or continues to be your biggest struggle? And how have you been approaching it?
Oh, man. Um, I think my biggest struggle that has probably um, been the most painful for me to deal with over time has been coming in with a lot of these, uh, you know, beliefs and hopes about the way that we should work together, and then not being well equipped enough to make that environment happen or happen consistently. And an easy example of this was wanting to have a super high degree of autonomy for every member of the team, have every person have a voice in so many big decisions, exposing to all of those people the information they need to make that choice. And then a lot of the reality is like, dude, filtering for people that want that whole stack of responsibility and that whole stack of context is super hard. Balancing when they should be thinking about all of these far reaching thoughts when they also have tactical stuff that needs to get into the game is often more important. And also the environment it takes for that kind of back and forth to be value adding as opposed to just like endless distraction, super hard. And I think a lot of that is just down to me as an organizational leader creating really clear expectations, creating really clear performance goals, creating really clear communication, uh, again, expectations that people should be following, and finding that I've gotten to benefit a lot from environments where I'm like, man, working with this crew, like we're an ace crew that we could talk about anything, we could figure out anything. The same relationship I cultivated with Ryan. The skill of cultivating that relationship on a one-on-one basis is not the same as creating that for a team. And I think that's been hard and kind of disappointing to watch myself struggle with that. And fortunately, through a lot of trial and error, we've come to I think a better, also just less naive middle ground where it's like, no, like someone has an explicit responsibility where they are the last buck for the game direction. And here is the space where we make that info available because, hey, this person's working on something interconnected. And if they actually, do the extra work of seeing how their piece touches all these other things, it will benefit them. But here's the layer where I hold their feet to the fire on that actually happening. And those are actually a big gap between. It's not just me saying, hey, any member of the team could recite to you every component of how this game fits together, and realizing that maybe was even a foolish goal to start with for the complexity of game we're building, for the size of team that we have. And that I feel like was a long stumbling journey of figuring out the reality of how I think this team should work, and not just like this lofty goal I had in the sky, but actually no, what is best for this crew now, married with some of the aspiration, a piece of the aspiration that I had in the beginning that guides me toward a direction. Yeah, so that one I think has felt like a lot of personal failure in trying to pursue that.
As you've been sort of dealing with that, and all the other myriad of challenges that you've faced as a founder and on your founding journey really and been working through, what have you found to be sort of your primary support structures for yourself? Like where do you turn
Oh,
to like make sure that you yourself are supported on your own founding journey?
yeah. So outside of work, been on a long journey of like building those more explicitly. and sort of rebuilding those, both leaving Riot, where I had just, over 7 years built up a bunch of things that were easy to take for granted, but also with the pandemic and going full remote and being locked in a room for many, many months. I felt like I had to rebuild a lot of things very intentionally. So, exercising regularly, sleeping more, changing my relationship with sleep so that it's not something I despise because it costs productivity or fun time, but actually something that helps me keep my head in the game and do my best work and be my best self. Investing in a lot of hobby time and being really deliberate about how I spend my time. I actually block out every hour of my day and weekends now. Uh, Sometimes it's like, it's not super tight, but I'll be like, no, I'm going to exercise at 11 and then I'm going to go meet my friends at lunch at 12:30. Like that's my plan, right? Just so that I don't slip into the orange soda of how I spend my time, which is like, scrolling Reddit or on Twitter or like, playing a game that I know I don't actually need to play again, but I've really invested in a lot in like a series of those, and some of them pretty different from one another. Like I wanted a hobby that was off screen, so I picked up miniature painting again. I wanted a way to see my friends more consistently, so I found and built a group for D&D that was like people who were super into it for the shared storytelling and really good about actually making time for that together. And so just a ton of things like that on top of just the people, like my wife, seeing a handful of friends that are my most consistent support structure, and trying to keep those things in balance even when shit hits the fan. Yeah, that's worked pretty well as a trend. It's certainly pretty hard to hold up when you hit those really dense periods, like when we launched our demo during some fundraising. I'm like, oh yeah, like I guess I knew conceptually that this was going to be 100-hour week, and here it is actually in practice 100-hour week, and it's a lot more painful of recovery than I remember, than I thought it would be.
Do you have a gap that you're still like, I haven't found the right way to support myself in this? Like, what's sort of the
Totally.
biggest gap there that you found?
I think actually taking fuel from wins, and I feel like this is almost a team-wide problem. Maybe I've subliminally like reinforced this on the team. Both myself and our team has this big tendency to be like, yeah, cool, that went well, but like, what's the next thing? What's the problem that we're solving? Like, oh my God, there's still so much to do. And there's also the reality of like, dude, making games is super hard. We've been at this a long time. Like, we have to maintain sufficient positivity to keep doing our best work. And just out of the demo, we had so much objectively good things happen from the demo. But it feels like, I'll speak more to the personal side. It feels like it goes through like a 20% filter where I'm just like, oh, I'm glad that person's having fun. But this other thing is shit. And like, I can't believe we haven't fixed that yet,
Yeah.
And especially now over the arc of that journey, I'm like, we really got to be able to take more from the wins, because that's huge for like reinforcing us feeling like that hard push we made for quality was worth it. That thing we did that was directly related to player feedback, and now they're like so freaking happy about it. That is the broader thing we want to happen with the game. Like, we should practice feeling good. We should practice taking input. We should practice taking our wins from that so we can do it again. And I'm not great at that. I'm not great at that at all.
Yeah. I resonate with that deeply. So shifting a little bit, what is on the horizon for yourself and the company that you're spending a lot of time thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it is 100% shipping the game. I mean, that's sort of the edge of our horizon in a lot of ways, because we need to ship the game before we can see if we're actually successful with our first game, if we're able to keep the lights on, if we have the proof point that might make the difference for raising more funding or publishing deal or whatever. So it feels like that's really the big gate ahead of us. And I'm actually very excited for it, because I feel like we're in a great rhythm. We've been practicing what we've preached about playtesting, like playtesting every 2 weeks since like May of last year, which feels great. It feels like we're now reaping a lot of the rewards of actually practicing those muscles. And so I feel like that's sort of the ultimate proof point, even though there are big beats between here and there, where it really is like, all right, kid gloves are off. Like, you're paying real dollars or real money for this experience now. Does it hold up? Does it feel like it's actually bringing you delight in the ways that we hope it will bring you delight? And I think we're doing the right things to try and get an early radar sense of that earlier, but that's still going to be a huge learning moment for us. And one that I think I actually feel like, because of the way we've been approaching it, it'll be a lot easier to feel really proud of that, regardless of how that goes financially, which I feel like, comparing my current position to 2 years ago, I want to, again, see that as the win it is, which is like, I'm really happy with how we're playing the game. I'm really happy with how we're running the company, how we're approaching this challenge. And that's worth something too.
Let me close out the long form version of the questions with an entirely unfair one. Given the experience thus far, setting aside, some point in the future, who knows how Treehouse does, whether it mighty exit, IPO, whether it folds quietly in the night, who knows, anywhere in between. But given the experience thus far, would you start another company?
I would, with one big asterisk. Well, two. I would, because even in this part of the journey that I've been through so far, we still haven't shipped a game. But even in this part of the journey so far, man, there's so many things where I'm like, oh my God, I could do that so much better if we did that again. So much better, like trajectory changing better. And that's really appealing to me. I think being able to do something that is that impactful, that has that big a chunk of value that it brings to the game you might build or to the people you work with, it's very tantalizing, honestly. But the two big asterisks are, the first is 100% the people that I would do it with. Because, man, I would have crumbled into dust years ago if not for Ryan, and if not for a bunch of the other team members that we have who I trust, like, with my life. And if I were like, oh, would you start another company, but like, you're on your own, or you're doing it with these people that you haven't worked, it would be like such a different ask. It's a totally different premise in my mind. The second asterisk is one that I'm still working on myself, and I think I may be working on for decades, which is, right now, the startup experience is so all-consuming that it costs something for every other part of my life. It, I think, actively makes me a worse friend. I think it makes me a worse partner to my wife. I think it occupies every corner of my brain that isn't actively assigned with a slot on the calendar for the weekend or whatever. And, like, I don't want to handle it that way if I were to do it again. I see other founders who maybe they still feel some of that same weight on their shoulders, but they have more fun doing it. They can be really good parents while doing it. And they can find that other balance to be like, yes, I am all in on this. And also, I'm all in on these important relationships in my life, these other things that ultimately are a huge part of like a successful life, in my opinion. And right now, I don't think I'm doing a great job of balancing that. And if I don't figure that out, then I think I'd probably be looking at a net more unhappy experience to be founding again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I resonate with that a lot. I think a lot of founders struggle with that, even when outward facing. The outward facing version of it, when you're not living that life, can seem a lot of ways, but so much of it, I think, ends up being an effort of practice and then finding the balance in motion, right? Like, to your point, like the 100-hour weeks and how you find the balance in that week is going to be different than, the one after you ship, where you can take a breath and you can recharge those things. And like, it's just always finding that balance point in the motion of the world around you and the work.
Yeah. The truly all-consuming moments, I think, as a founder, are not that frequent.
No.
Like the fundraising week where it's 100 hours, like launch week,
Nope.
a big event or something like that. The rest is like, no, I just simply don't have the ability to resist
Yes.
going deeper into the work hole.
Yes. The rest of it is discipline.
Yeah.
So the way I tend to cap off the interviews, and I appreciate you spending a little bit of extra time here with us.
Yeah, sorry, that's code for me talking too much.
No, you're good. You're good. I asked extra questions. It's all good. But the way I like to cap this off is what I call the introspection lightning round. Where it actually came from is these are a series of questions that I sort of kick off any co-founder date that I did when I was sort of searching for co-founders and talking to folks that had. And really, it was the questions I would give folks as homework before our first meeting to be like, hey, I'm going to show up with my answers to these. I want you to show up with your answers to these, and we'll go through them. And just, it's the start of an alignment. They come from a friend of mine's observation that the strengths and weaknesses of the company is almost always a reflection of the strengths and weaknesses of the founders. And so I figure, like, let's start with that, because me thinking about what terrible things my companies might do because of my own weaknesses has kept me up at night. So like I tend to incept that into other people's brains. So I'm going to take you through them, and just very quickly, we'll go through and ask them lightning round style. So we start off with, what is your professional superpower?
Ooh. Oh, professional superpower.
I mean, it can be a little bit broader than that, but yeah, like, what is your superpower? But if it's totally unrelated to work, then what is your work-related superpower?
No, it is work-related, but I think it is more sweeping. I think it's authenticity. I think a lot of the approach that I take toward, when we have plans, like when we talk about things, when I try to convince a team member that something's worth doing, it always comes from a very authentic place that I think resonates with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that translate to talking to our players. I've seen that translate to big pitches and individual decisions. And I feel like that's something that has made it easier to keep working together, even when I mess up, or even when there's like a huge problem we're trying to overcome.
Awesome. And outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I think I take a very like humble approach to a lot of things, where I'm very willing to hear other perspectives and believe going in that I don't have the whole picture or that I'm wrong in some way. And that is really important, I think, within our industry, where it's like stuff changes so fast. And so I go in very humble with our like humble and open about my thought process. I think on the flip side, I've invested a lot and grown a lot in terms of a lot of like my strategic thinking, and that's been a huge value to us as we've like navigated different versions of the same premise of how we target some of these player needs. There's a lot of like logic that connects together in a meaningful way that other people can pick up and run with, and I think that's been really helpful for us, and something that I try to advocate for our larger team practicing well. I think the third is I always seek to care about the people by default. It's like in the interview process, through like hearing about someone being super frustrated or watching someone like get super amped about something, I default to being like, dude, how are you feeling? Like, why do you feel that way? What's going on? And I think my friend has this way of saying this that I love, which is like, every problem is a people problem. And I think that's super true. And I think that is kind of close to how I default to seeing things, which is like, no, like regardless of what we do, our odds of succeeding are way higher if we're all bought into it. So like, let's talk about it. Like, what can I share with you that would actually help us look at this the same way? And I think that has also probably kind of permeated the company. At least I hope it has.
The flip side is, what is your big weakness?
Yeah, I think one of them we talked about was some of the management capability or the the management practices to maintain the level of accountability on a lot of like soft and difficult expectations around how we communicate, or like scope of thinking that I want everyone to have the requirements to actually have that level of responsibility on every person. I feel like my approach to that has not been great, and that's probably been a reflection of not being experienced enough in like cultivating a um, like organizational practices that are that far out from like day to day production, because that zone is much more comfortable for me. So I think that one's definitely a weakness. The other one that we also talked about was just not uh, uh, trending toward the mistakes and the failures mentally too, in a lot of what we do. And I think that can lead, it's not the same as, but I think it can lead to pessimism, or feeling down, or feeling like you're not getting um, a real picture of like the good you've also accomplished. And I think that is like a critical fuel source, especially the longer you're at it. And so I feel like that's definitely something that I struggle with, and often have to switch over to playing the cheerleader for the team. And that helps me break out of that.
What are your stress reactions?
Hmm. I think I carry a lot of stress actually in my neck and back. Twice during the arc of this startup, I've lost feeling in an arm because of pinched nerves, which is an interesting thing to learn about how my body reacts as I get older. Um, so that's a physiological one. But I think more in some of the problem solving is that I get a lot more harsh about my frameworks, which is actually, I think, in contrast with some of my more human approach, where I'll be like, no, zoom out. How does that make sense as a framework? Like, what is the actual like behavior we're talking about here? Like, why did this happen, right? And like needing to understand the logical reason for how that happened, and getting really fixated on that. I think in a way, often I think that's helpful, because I think that's better than the other trap of like falling into the emotional side. But it also can just be kind of jarring, because I'm generally like a very effusive person, or one that is like actively trying to understand the human element. And that's often like a, we'll get back to the human part later, like how did this logically happen, like someone explain this to me.
And finally, what are your upkeep needs?
Like in terms of how I stay not how do I prevent myself from going insane?
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost is time with family and with friends,
Mm-hmm.
time with my wife, time to actually see my friends and talk with them and decompress with them. I think that's the most extroverty part of myself, is actually, that is huge for me, feeling like a fuller person that isn't just boiled down to this problem that we're trying to solve. Um, as much as I don't want to admit it, sleep is really critical for that. And I think really investing in that over time has been really huge. And then the last one is one that I've been very fortunate in, I think, which is being able to talk about these things with a lot of other peers, a lot of these stressors, a lot of these challenges, whether they're people challenges or startup challenges or founder challenges. And I am really lucky to know a lot of people in a similar journey that are very like intellectually curious, that are very empathetic, that are very capable, all of which like make me always feel like I have people I can go to if I ask, people who will commiserate with me, people who have fucked up in the exact same ways that I have. uh, and that support network, I think, has been huge for making this whole journey feel a lot more like a shared one than like, I'm gonna be in this like solo journey through space.
Well, that's the end of the lightning round. As we wrap up, thank you so much for spending time with us. Was there anything you wanted to sort of share as either closing thoughts or as a shout out or shill, or sort of like put a spotlight on for our listeners here at the end of the episode?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just a couple to shill, which is, I am Michael Chu from Treehouse Games. We're working on a survival crafting game called Voyagers of Nira. It's a seafaring survival crafting game about exploring a magical ocean world. You can find us at Voyagers of Nira, Nera. And if you want to keep tabs on what we're doing as a company, you'll also see us posting there and posting on our Steam page all the time. In terms of the other shout outs or like the broader wisdom, the thing that I'd want to say is actually just to pass on some advice that was the most helpful for me, which is that there are a lot of good resources out there to learn about the startup experience or the game development experience more than ever. And the truth is, like, the games industry has this unique advantage, which is that it stems from a ton of people who loved games and because of that wanted to make games themselves. People are so willing to be helpful if you ask. And if you can ask in a humble and thoughtful and curious and passionate way and really demonstrate that passion for real. So go message people, actually take the time to message them, and you'll get a lot more responses than you think. You can listen to podcasts like this. Elite Game Developers was huge for me for learning about the startup journey. And there are so many great videos on YouTube of just like awesome developers who are talking about their journey that I've learned a ton from. And they're just like people who talk like people. And that is absolutely huge, I think, for getting a real look at both how hard, but also how possible it is to make games and make a company.
Awesome. And I think you might have said this in the thing, but just to call it out explicitly, if someone wanted to take up your advice and had heard something on this podcast that they thought was really interesting and wanted to reach out and get a hold of you, what is the best way for them to do that?
The best way for them to do that would be to send me a message on Twitter or Blue Sky and X. So my at is WhatChu, WATCHU, which is my last name, no, KNOW. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well, but it is definitely harder to cut through all of the sales and spam there.
Yeah. We love we love a good username pun, so I appreciate it deeply. Well, thank you.
We're professionals, I swear.
Hey, man, I go by status quo on everything, so there are no stones thrown here. Thank you so much for spending time, Michael. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hall, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founders support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.